It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, good morning.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, we're going to know a lot about the difference between corporate science and honest science.
That's right. On the show today, we're going to talk about how corporations manipulate science to make dangerous products seem safe. We're going to do that with Dr. David Michaels, author of The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. He cites bogus studies, congressional testimonies, think tank policy documents. All of these things are tools in the corporate toolbox to muddy the waters, to throw up dust, to create doubt about the straightforward conclusions of science. We have seen this in the climate debate, which just the fact that I'm using the word debate shows how pervasive it is. There is no scientific debate about the climate science, but that just shows how effective it has been. And this is not a recent phenomenon. This is a tactic that has been used by corporate power and their enablers in the political arena for decades. The tobacco industry, the auto industry, even in the professional sports industry, they've all tried to cast doubt on the scientific facts when those facts were inconvenient to their profit making. So we look forward to that discussion with Dr. Michaels, who has a tremendous amount of experience in the occupational health and safety field. And as always, after that, we will take a short break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, whose own many reports, regular listeners know, have dealt with the same subject. In the second half of the show, David and I are going to talk to Ralph about the latest developments in the coronavirus pandemic. We're going to talk more about what Trump is doing, of course, and Ralph is going to tell us what he thinks about Bernie Sanders' status as frontrunner in the Democratic primary. And if we have some time left over, we'll try to knock out a few listener questions. But first, there has been a lot of outrage directed in recent times at Donald Trump's anti-science policies, with movements such as the March for Science. But our next guest argues that this is nothing new and actually the result of decades of campaigns by the tobacco and fossil fuel industries, for instance, to stop the regulation of deadly products. David?
Dr. David Michaels is an epidemiologist and professor at George Washington University School of Public Health. He was Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health under President Barack Obama. Under President Bill Clinton, he was Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environment, Safety, and Health, charged with protecting workers, residents, and the environment around U.S. nuclear weapons facilities. Dr. Michaels has won many awards for his science advocacy and has authored The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. David Michaels.
Well, thank you so much, David. I'm happy to be on the show.
Welcome indeed. This is a very unique book because it not only reflects experience and affects everybody listening to this program, people around the country, but it names names. It names the names of corporate lawyers, scientists for sale, politicians who deceive along with the scientists. And in that sense, very, very useful. Dr. Michaels' book has been out a few weeks now, Oxford University Press. He's yet to be interviewed by NPR or PBS. Maybe our listeners can help resolve that exclusion. Let me start with this, Dr. Michaels. In your book, you say, quote, "The scientific enterprise is at a crossroads, I believe. We as a society are at a crossroads. We need to understand what's still going on, what the consequences have already been for public health. You say that how science can be used to either protect our health and planetary well-being or misused to damage them. And you talk about a lot of things that are kitchen table issues. You talk about how the misuse of science has supported excessive sugar, excessive utilization of alcohol, toxic chemicals, contamination of water pollution, and of course, deferring a straight-on challenge to the perils of climate catastrophe. I thought your table of contents was revealing too. It talks about the forever chemical, which we'll get to, the deal with diesel, on opioids, deadly dust, Volkswagen's other bug, the climate denial machine, and sickeningly sweet, relating to heavy sugar in food. So let me start with your more intriguing statements in your book, Dr. Michaels. You mention President Trump's desire to reverse anything the Obama administration did. If Obama supported it, Trump would do the opposite, no matter what the consequences, end quote. Can you elaborate that?
Well, certainly. There are so many different areas in which the Trump administration has just looked at what the Obama administration did and tried to do the opposite, even in the face of what some of the big corporations want. And everything that we learn in Political Science 101 tells us that when major corporations want something from the federal government, they generally get it. So the Trump administration not only is rolling back auto mileage standards on behalf of the oil industry, which really will benefit from it, but they've done some things like try to push through a regulation that would allow the most dirty diesel belching engines, ones that put out particulates that will cause hundreds or perhaps thousands of cases of cancer. They're rolling back regulations that would allow that over the objections of the trucking industry and the biggest engine manufacturers. The only way to explain that is it's a reaction against what the Obama administration did, because there are only a couple of companies that want this, and the big guys don't even want that. But mostly what they're doing is really on behalf of corporate polluters and manufacturers of dangerous materials. One of the first things Scott Pruitt did when he took office to run the EPA was to roll back a decision that was made by the EPA earlier to ban a really terrible pesticide called chlorpyrifos. This is a chemical that slows down children's neurological development. It impedes it, and no one should be exposed to it. In Europe, it's been banned. The evidence is very clear, but Dow Chemical didn't want to be banned. The president of Dow, or the CEO of Dow, met with the administration, and lo and behold, they reversed that decision. Now, California has moved forward and will ban that chemical. Hawaii has already banned it. So Dow, or actually it has a new name, but Dow finally will take it off the market. But that's only because people organized around it. Environmental groups, farm worker organizations said, we've got to get this chemical off the market.
It's amazing that he's not only buckling to corporate lobbyist demands of the worst kind to increase the peril, the hazard, the casualties to men, women, children, families all over the country, regardless of whether they're Trump voters or not. But he even, in his obsession against Obama, is pulling back on standards that the companies have already complied with and said, why are you doing this? Explain the rollback on mercury emissions, which are deadly.
Exactly the same thing. Mercury is present in coal, and if you burn coal, as many utilities that generate electricity do, the mercury gets up into the air. It then is deposited on the ground. It goes into plants. Fish eat the mercury, and the fish become toxic. And again, that has an impact on children, on pregnant women. The utility industry, all those coal-burning electrical generating plants, have said, don't roll back this regulation. We have it under control. We think we can control the mercury. Trump is just ignoring them, really because the Obama administration moved to control mercury emissions. It is frightening, it's dangerous, and the cost in terms of human development is huge.
And the gross parallel of this, of course, is opening up the floodgates of oil and gas exploration, production, ignoring energy efficiency, ignoring renewable energy by Trump, and in effect releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gases, which will further produce massive storms, wildfires, tornadoes, floods, and he's making America dangerous again.
That's exactly right. At the same time, he is really decapitating the federal science advisory committees that help the agencies figure out exactly what's going on and advise them on how to better protect the public. And they're getting rid of a bunch of the advisory committees and then stacking the rest of them with folks who have a very similar view. They don't even represent the big corporations. They represent the most extreme position of saying we should do nothing at all to better protect the public.
I mean, the rampage that Trump is on now is extraordinary even by his standards of a couple of years ago. He's now telling the agencies, don't you dare use the word climate change. He's told the Centers for Disease Control that. And when an epidemiologist, one of your career colleagues, protested, he was in charge of a section of CDC connecting human health with climate. change. They ostracized him, made him stay at home, and effectively shut down the 20-person group, although they're still employed. And when he wants to come back to his desk, he has an armed escort. So this is just part of it. The other part, what Trump is doing, he wants all the judges that are appointed to the federal courts to basically play to his drumbeat and crush any kind of protective health, safety, and economic policies and standards coming out of Washington, D.C., and turn the government over to Wall Street. So the situation is very dire, and they use scientists for sale, which you have described in your book. So why don't you describe science for sale in the context of one of your chapters, which is Sickeningly Sweet?
Well, and that's really about the sugar industry and food manufacturers that rely deeply on sugar, like particularly the soda industry, Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, those are the big ones, and through their trade association, the American Beverage Association, they have done everything they can to convince people and to convince the government that sugar is not bad for you. Even though, sugar really is empty calories. You get calories, you get no nutrients from it. And if you're limiting your food intake, you certainly shouldn't rely on sugar. You should be getting better intake. But really, since the 1940s, the sugar industry has focused on opposing science, opposing the evidence, opposing research that says things like sugar increases your risk of diabetes or obesity. In fact, one of the stories I tell in the book is that when the tobacco industry first got off the ground in terms of their whole playbook, their denial playbook, when they launched their program to convince the public that the evidence that tobacco causes lung cancer is unclear and uncertain, the very day they launched that, the former director of the Sugar Research Foundation wrote them a letter saying, "You need my help. I was doing this for sugar in the 1940s, and they hired him, of course, to become the deputy director of their program to fool the public. The sugar industry has continued that for many years, and just most recently, over the last few years, you could see what the beverage companies have done. And, first they had a big campaign that Coca-Cola ran, they hid their involvement, to convince people that the problem isn't caloric or sugar intake. You just need more exercise. As long as you have, as they call, balance, that if you exercise enough, you can drink as much soda as you want. Of course, what they don't say is you would have to exercise all the time, and it's really not possible to burn off all the sugar you're taking in through Coca-Cola and Pepsi and those other products. But of course, Coca-Cola didn't tell you that they were behind that. What they've also done,
fortunately, that was disclosed by the press. They did a good
job
exposing that.
Yeah, it's actually, again, a scientist who picked it out, found it, and then gave it to the New York Times that really then ran with it. And Coca-Cola was embarrassed. And the thing about a company like Coca-Cola is you can embarrass them. A lot of chemical companies, they don't really care what you think about them. They're not publicly facing. They don't worry about consumers. But if Coca-Cola looks bad, you could go to one of their rivals. So it's actually an effective strategy to go after them. But what they do through their American Beverage Association is they hire these, what I call mercenary scientists. These are product defense consulting firms whose business model is based on providing whatever answer the company wants, their sponsor wants. So there have been lots of studies that show sugar increases risk of obesity or diabetes. What they have hired these scientists to do is to review all this literature and conclude, lo and behold, the evidence really isn't clear. There's too much uncertainty. All the studies are low quality. Therefore, we shouldn't tell people to consume less of our product, sugar-sweetened beverages.
Well, let's talk about a substance that may be in the bodies of all our listeners, glyphosate. Glyphosate is produced by Monsanto. And on page 159 of your book, you lay the predicate for what I want to ask you about. And that is, there was a House of Representatives minority report that came out about glyphosate. And you say, quote, "It describes the secret efforts by Monsanto and the American Chemistry Council, the industry's trade association, to discredit the IARC, which is an international science group, including, get this, ghostwriting scientific papers and articles in business publications, hiring journalists to discredit the agency, establishing front groups that appear to be independent, and aggressively attempting to silence scientists who were involved in the IARC process or who publicly agreed with the IARC conclusions about the cancer-causing impact of glyphosate. You want to elaborate that, Dr. Michaels?
That's right. Sure. Now, glyphosate is a very important pesticide. It's used with genetically modified organisms. It'll kill anything. If you spray it over a field of soybeans, for example, if the soybean is grown from a seed that is modified to be resistant to glyphosate, glyphosate won't kill it, but it'll kill everything else. So it is very widely used. It's the number one herbicide in the world. It's made by Monsanto. Monsanto has recently been purchased actually by Bayer, the big German pharmaceutical company. There's a branch of the World Health Organization called the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They issue classifications or categorizations of different exposures, whether or not they cause cancer. And they said, we looked at the literature and we think that glyphosate probably causes cancer. There's a lot of animal evidence and there's some human evidence as well that glyphosate is associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so they issued this finding that's probable. It's not definite, but it's probable. Monsanto mounted a really nasty, underhanded campaign, and you read some of the things they did. They hired scientists, in fact, some of the same scientists who work for the sugar industry, to write reports that made it look like they were independent, though they were in fact paid by Monsanto, to say, we looked at the literature, and of course we don't see a connection at all. But they went after all of the scientists who were on that World Health Organization panel, and they subpoenaed them, and they actually, when the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, they were able to get one of the committees in the House to start putting pressure on say, we're going to defund you, because a lot of their money comes from the U.S. government. It's an incredibly ugly campaign. When that all came out, which has come out in some court cases, mostly in California, I have to say jurors were furious. There have been a number of workers who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma who they said, we think it's caused by all this glyphosate exposure, and they were heavily exposed to glyphosate. When they sued, they won in court, but in a couple of cases, the jurors looked at all these documents and they said, boy, Monsanto acted so poorly. It was so unethical what they did. In some cases, they gave them hundreds of millions or even $1 billion punitive damage to send a message to the owners of Monsanto saying what you did in terms of lying about the evidence and the underhanded campaign was wrong. Now, Bayer purchased Monsanto, and the Wall Street Journal has called it one of the worst corporate deals ever made. Right now, Bayer is worth the same amount that they paid for Monsanto. That's how badly they were hit. So once in a while, companies get caught when they play these games with science. For the most part, they don't.
Well, let's talk about another chapter. You say Volkswagen's other bug. What do you mean by that?
Well, what's very well known is Volkswagen tried to become the number one auto company in the world by what they claimed was a new technology diesel engine. And it is a new technology diesel engine, but it's still not clean. And, diesel sends out lots of different emissions. They put out nitrogen oxides, which leads to smog and actually causes lung damage, and also puts out these particulates, the soot, what you see, which causes lung cancer. But when Volkswagen said we want to sell a lot of diesel engines, they had to convince people that it was safe and that these people were buying clean engines because no one wants to buy a car that's going to be polluting the atmosphere. And so they put in what we call a defeat device. This is a software program that runs the engine that when you took your car into the Department of Motor Vehicles to get emissions tested, the software would sense that it was on one of these machines that held the car in the right place to test the engine, and it would put out no emissions. It would be phenomenally clean. And then when it went out to the road, it would put out many times the number, 40 to 80 times the emissions. And so they were really destroying, putting out a huge amount of pollutants, and everybody thought they were safe. Eventually, they were caught by actually the California Air Resources Board, and Volkswagen eventually sort of fessed up to it. But in the meantime, and this is the story I tell in the book, their public relations people said, we need to come up with a story that makes diesel look safe, or new diesel look safe, because this World Health Organization, the same group that we just talked about for glyphosate, had said correctly that diesel engine exhaust is a carcinogen. It causes lung cancer. And so it's a great story. I'll only tell it very briefly. Originally, they said, well, we'll do a study where we'll put people on bicycles exercising and we'll pump in some of the emissions from our Volkswagen Beetles and we'll show that it's not very dangerous. But I think they realized the optics of a German company putting people in chambers and pumping in gas wasn't really going to fly. So instead, they used monkeys, and they set up a study in New Mexico paid by a lab. And when they didn't get the result they wanted, they withheld the money from the lab until the scientists at the lab changed the result so it would say exactly what Volkswagen wanted them to say. I mean, they didn't care about actually what they were, the pollution or the science. They just wanted the public relations ability to say, our engines are safe.
And listeners should know that this deception not only put into the air nitrogen oxides. Fortunately, there were only about 580,000 such cars in the U.S. Most of the cars are in Europe and other countries, and most of the ones in the U.S. were in California. It cost VW billions and billions of dollars in fines and payouts. And where's VW now? Right up there at the top, selling cars and making profits. You see, the corporate entity is so resistant to any kind of serious accountability. They transfer the costs, they deduct the costs on their tax returns, and they're back in business. Well, you have this intriguing chapter title called The Forever Chemical, before we get to the one on the climate denial machine. What's the forever chemical? We're talking with Dr. David Michaels, the author of a brand new book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. He headed the Occupational Safety and Health Administration under Obama, about which we'll return. What is the forever chemical?
These forever chemicals, they're called PFAS chemicals. The F is for fluorine. They will protect any material, cloth, paper, from oil or water. And so they're the basis for Teflon, Gore-Tex, Scotchgard, all the materials that we're very familiar with. They're in all of our bodies. There is so much of this used on food wrapping, on boxes, pizza boxes. They're everywhere, and we have a lot of evidence they're really quite dangerous. In fact, there is really no safe level of exposure. The levels of exposure which we think don't cause harm are down in the low parts per trillion. So this is a chemical which we really should be getting out of our water. We should be getting out of our food. But right now, there's still far too much exposure of it.
Under California law, doesn't that have to be disclosed on the pizza package?
That's a good question. I would think it should be, but these PFAS chemicals have huge effects. They're well documented to cause cancer as well as a number of other outcomes related to the immune system. They're on the package of the pizza, so I actually don't know exactly if that's a requirement under Proposition 65.
That could really expose the situation you're talking about and radiate right through the country, and might lead to some success, because California has the toughest labeling law for any carcinogens. Let me ask you about this. You give a positive story about the issuance by OSHA, when you headed OSHA, of the silica standard in 2016. But before I have you explain how important that is to workers in particular, I heard in 2012, during the presidential campaign, you wanted to issue that standard, and the Obama politicos wanted you to put it off. What was the situation there? What's the true story there, Dr. Michael?
That's right. I mean, silica causes a disease called silicosis, and it also causes lung cancer. And more than 2 million workers in the United States are exposed to silica. It's common in construction sites. It's sand, but much, much finer, not the sand we see on the beach, but 100 times smaller. It gets in your lungs. It can cause real damage. OSHA's standard was hopelessly out of date. And when I got to OSHA in 2009, people had been working on a standard for a long time, but the Bush administration never wanted to have it see the light of day. We worked very hard on it, and we pushed from the beginning. But it's controversial because many employers, especially in the building trades and construction, didn't want to see it happen. So when we were getting ready to send our first draft to the White House, we got word saying this is not going to move forward for the moment. The reason is, in the very beginning of the Obama administration, under the Democrat Congress, had passed two major pieces of legislation. One was the Affordable Care Act, and the other was the Dodd-Frank reform of the financial system. At that point, we're approaching the election in 2012. The White House felt anything controversial at that point could lead to Obama not getting a second term. And if President Obama didn't win a second term, those two really landmark pieces of legislation would be rolled back and overturned. And they pointed out something you're trying to do, the silica regulation, for example, would never survive because we'd have to go into the second term to finish it anyway. And so essentially it went on hold for a year or a little more than a year until after the election when President Obama was reelected in 2012. We could then start moving forward again. And I understood the reasoning for it. It was unfortunate. I think the concern was anything, we'd won these two victories and we couldn't justify anything that could jeopardize those. And so we held the silica regulation and didn't move forward for really over a year.
Well, it's nothing new for me.
Yeah.
Ever since I pushed to get OSHA through in 1970, there's always been White House pressure in addition to corporate pressure on OSHA. Let's back up a bit. I think this is going to surprise our listeners. Give an estimate of how many workplace-related deaths, that's the causal phrase, are involved in America every year. How many workplace-related deaths in terms of trauma, like collapse of a construction site, and in terms of disease, like silicosis or coal miners' pneumoconiosis?
Well, the trauma, we have a good idea for, and it's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, which is, ends up being 14 people a day are killed on the worksite with a traumatic injury. There are no good studies. We only have estimates of the number of workers who are dying from cancer related to exposure to benzene or silica or asbestos, formaldehyde. And the last studies that were done by other federal agencies, and they're good studies, probably about 50,000 a year.
Okay. I heard the total figure I heard about 15 years ago was 58,000 workplace-related deaths from disease and trauma.
Right.
And that doesn't count injuries and sickness and disability, people who survive, but their livelihoods are ruined and their life quality is severely disabled, right?
That's correct. Right now, just based on the numbers of injuries employers report, a different branch of the Labor Department, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, estimates there are somewhere around 3 or 4 million serious injuries a year. And recently, they've done some studies which looked at those numbers compared to people who go into workers' compensation or who have other problems. And they know that they're missing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the injuries. So it could easily be true that 5 million workers have a serious injury a year. And that gets no public attention in a major way.
It's by far the most underreported, other than medical malpractice, source of death and injury and sickness in America today. Now, here's why I think it's going to startle our listeners. The annual budget to maintain the giant U.S. embassy in Iraq following the criminal war that destroyed that country by Bush and Cheney, who are fugitives from justice, was about $500 million. What is the annual budget of OSHA, the federal agency that's supposed to deal with an estimated 1,000 workplace-related deaths a week and millions of injuries and sicknesses every year? What's the budget?
Just about that number. I think we're at 540 million, 550 million. It's about the same as what it costs to run that embassy in Iraq. OSHA is disastrously underfunded, and it shows how little the U.S. government, and this is true of both Democratic and Republican administrations, how much they care about the working people of the United States, to me. I mean, this agency should be far larger.
One of your predecessors told me that when I asked him what the budget of OSHA should be, he said, "What's the budget for EPA?" I told him about $8 billion. He said, "That's what the budget for OSHA should be." Now, what is the role of organized labor here? We're talking about international unions like the Machinist Union and the AFL-CIO. What are they doing? And my information is that the AFL-CIO, which represents over 13 million workers through the member unions, has only one full-time staff in Washington working on occupational disease and health.
They actually have two, but it's certainly not enough. We wouldn't have an OSHA but for the organizing of the labor movement and you and people like you, because you were hand in hand in the exactly 50 years ago. It was 1969, 1970 that the OSHA law was passed. It was passed in December 1970. And all all the advances that OSHA has made really were because they had the support and the pressure at the same time of the labor movement. But as I think all your listeners know, the labor movement has gotten much weaker. It's certainly much smaller. It represents only 6% of the private sector workforce. And many unions, in getting smaller, no longer have full-time safety and health staff. They still care about safety and health, and we could not have done our silica standard without the support of the bricklayers union, for example, where workers are heavily exposed to silica, the laborers, the steel workers, the machinists, and others. But they have less ability to support OSHA and to help OSHA fight for better conditions for workers. And this is
how well I remember that fight, Dr. Michaels. The hero in the House wasn't even on the relevant committee. He was Congressman Burton from California. What a driver, what an energizer. It was such a pleasure working for him on the paragraph by paragraph of the OSHA bill. And so you have the 50th anniversary of this champion bill of worker health and safety in this country in December. Are there any plans by the labor movement to highlight this and bring it to the attention of the media and the American people?
We've certainly been talking about it. I think there either the passage of the bill, which was December 29th, 1970, so that anniversary is coming up, or OSHA opening its doors in April. It'll be Workers' Memorial Day 2021, and that's April 28th. There will likely be some activity. The labor movement will do some things. I'm hoping that the federal government actually steps up to the plate as well and recognizes this. And actually, to me, this is the moment to look back at OSHA and say, it's done some very important things. I mean, when OSHA started, there were 37 deaths every day in the American workplace. There are now 14 every day. I mean, 14 is unacceptable, but we've made some real progress.
In terms of trauma, not disease.
In trauma, right. But the gaps in OSHA are enormous. OSHA has standards for a few hundred chemicals, and almost every one of those standards is based on studies from the 1960s or earlier. They're so out of date that we know that people are getting sick at levels which are considered safe by OSHA. OSHA has enough inspectors now to visit every workplace once every 165 years.
Listen to that, listeners. Once in 165 years.
It's unacceptable. And the fines are very low. I mean, fortunately, we were able to get Congress to raise the fines in 2015. When I got to OSHA, they fined for a serious violation. The maximum fine was $7,000. It's now $12,000, so it's a little higher. Fines are powerful incentives for very small employers.
No matter how serious, $12,000? That's what the Walmart CEO makes in 1 hour.
Yes. In fact, some years ago, we had a very terrible event at a Walmart in Valley Stream, Long Island. It was a Black Friday. They advertised great deals if you got there at 5 in the morning, and they didn't think about what they were doing. And a worker there, a security guard, was crushed by the crowd and killed. When OSHA went to court and said this was a serious violation, that Walmart should have had crowd control plans, and there was a $7,000 fine. Walmart spent, I'm sure, millions of dollars fighting that all the way up. It didn't get to the Supreme Court. It got almost to the Supreme Court. OSHA won at every level, but just to fight a $7,000 fine, that's the challenge of OSHA. The big companies can outgun, they can outlawyer OSHA. OSHA is really understaffed.
But that legal action against Walmart, Dr. Mars, sent out a signal. So now so-called Black Friday is not subject to these huge rushes when the doors open, because all the stores now and the owners of these chains know that they could incur serious liability. So it did have a good benefit.
Oh, that's right. And that's one of the ways when I ran OSHA, I would really try to pick our cases that we pushed hard to set examples for the rest of industry. Because, you can't visit every workplace. But so what you have to do is you've got to impact employers who you're not inspecting. We had a real problem with DuPont, and we had one terrible incident in Texas where 4 workers were overcome with a gas. They were making a pesticide, an insecticide, and they were killed. And OSHA's fine was $90,000. It was embarrassing. And then we went in and did some more inspections, and our next fine was $230,000. This is, pocket change to DuPont. And so I issued a very powerful press release saying that the entire safety system of DuPont had failed. DuPont makes a lot of money selling their safety consulting. And that was the message that DuPont needed to get. The CEO actually came to see me after that and committed to improvement. And so OSHA has to use different tools, but Right now, OSHA is not doing those things. They're doing far fewer press releases.
My appraisal
You
of
can
all
imagine.
this, if you put together the horrific casualty toll of American workers over the decades in workplaces, mines, factories, foundries, agricultural plantations, etc., and you measure that up against the feeble efforts by the state and local and federal regulatory agencies, the conclusion is America is saying to all these millions of workers, who cares? Who cares? I think if the heads of these unions decided to spend 1 week down on the shop floor, down in the mines, down in the foundries, down in where the crops are harvested, and then go back to their offices, they will put a much greater priority of their union on behalf of their imperiled workers. What do you think?
I think anything we can do to make this a high priority, we should be doing. What
do you think of this particular thing? That they go down 1 week, they work where their workers work to see what it's like.
I think a lot of them know it. I think the ones who don't know it are the senators, the members of Congress, the people at the White House who think that it's no big deal to go into a steel mill where there's molten steel everywhere, or work on these jobs at poultry processing lines where you're in the cold, it's wet, chickens are going by you at incredibly fast speeds, and you're supposed to do several 60 or more cuts a minute. These things destroy your arms. They're terrible jobs. And, the folks at the USDA, for example, the United States Department of Agriculture, have no idea, and they don't seem to care about these workers at all. So when we would raise issues...
That's a spectacular example. Imagine a documentary showing how many chickens are fleeting by the inspector per minute, and that the Trump administration wants to increase the speed so that even more chickens are pushed on the assembly line. And you can hardly, as an inspector, see the scabs and the deficiencies of these chickens. How many now are permitted per minute?
Well, it was 140, and now at many facilities, the USDA has allowed to go up to 170 per minute. I mean, it's unthinkable in terms of the work that workers have to do to process those, to cut those chickens as they pass by them.
Are you serious? 170 chickens a minute?
Now, it doesn't mean that you have to slice every one of those. You could have 2 or 3 people on the line together. But what we found was that we'd go into a chicken processing plant, and 40 or 50% of the workers there would have carpal tunnel syndrome or other conditions of their arms or shoulders or hands from this work. And we know the actual rate is far higher because once it gets bad enough, you have to leave. And there was one workplace where a different government agency went and they found 40% of this workers with this terrible condition, carpal tunnel. They went back a year later. They still found 40%. Many of the workers were just new workers. The other ones had left. These conditions are destroying people's arms, and they're leading to really lifetime disability. And
these are the truly forgotten Americans.
Yes.
We're running short of time, Dr. Michaels. Let's go global on your chapter briefly, although it's got to be more in brief, but we've had shows on this, the climate denial machine.
It is. The most extreme example, there is a clear scientific consensus. No one in the scientific community of any importance or really background still questions whether the accumulation of greenhouse gases isn't leading to these, climate change and severe climate events. I mean, we may not be able to say the specific event is caused by the buildup of greenhouse gases, but overall, this is what's going on. But as the introduction to this program said, if we're even discussing that there's a debate over this, they've won. The fossil fuel industry, the Koch brothers, have funded these questionable think tanks, a handful of scientists, and they're given equal time by reporters. They're out there saying, well, we're just not sure. The science isn't there. It's a tobacco model, but it's resulting in catastrophic climate change. And it's a machine it's right now, finally, some of the Republican leaders, Senator Marco Rubio, for example, has finally come around and said, well, maybe this is true. Maybe there really is climate change. I mean, come on.
As the floods at Miami Beach in Miami increase.
He's finally got to say it.
Senator Inhofe is still a hardliner. He thinks climate crisis is a hoax. He's from Oklahoma. But Senator Scott, who is the governor of Florida and who saw all those Republican villas and mansions being confronted by rising sea levels on the coast of Florida, he's changed. He now thinks climate crisis is real. So at least I think the momentum is in the favor of honest science, not corporate science. Honest science. I think our listeners would like to know the distinction. Corporate science is often secret, it's proprietary, it's driven by profit, and it doesn't get peer reviewed. Academic science gets peer reviewed, it's open, it's available for the public interest protection of the American people.
I think the only change I would make to that is there are now journals that are run by these mercenary scientists who do their own peer review. And so they will say this study is peer reviewed, even though I look at who their peers are and have some big questions. I think one of the lessons of my book is you cannot trust the science that's paid for by an industry that needs those results to protect itself.
What do you think needs to be done?
Well, we need to have a new structure of research. So the producers of those materials need to pay for the research. The jewel company needs to be paying for the research to figure out what are the long-term effects of smoking e-cigarettes, but they shouldn't control the research. We need a system where they put the money in, but the government or some sort of different body decides which scientists are going to get the money, what the methods are, what the results mean. How would you believe ExxonMobil to do research on the effects of exposure to benzene, for example, a product they make? For years, they've been saying it really doesn't cause the same illnesses that we know it causes. The tobacco industry is the best example. You don't believe in research paid for by Altria, and Altria, of course, is one of the owners of Juul Laboratories. We need to make sure that the science we use to protect ourselves, to protect the environment, has integrity. And as long as it's being controlled by people who need a certain result, we're not going to be able to trust it.
That's why we need the refunding of the Office of Science and Technology on Congress, which was defunded by Newt Gingrich in 1995. That provided very objective advice to the members of Congress and to the public. We need a new organization of academic scientists that can expose conflicts of interest, as documented in Shelley Krimsky's new book on scientists and conflict of interest. He teaches at Tufts University. So there are a lot of things that can be done, but we're very grateful for your contribution to this severely serious situation, Dr. David Michaels, who has just come out with a book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. And I hope that PBS, NPR, the networks, the cable channels start giving you more airtime and newspapers more print time. Because serious as this subject is, it's hardly mentioned even among the progressives in the presidential primaries that we see from week to week under a debate format. It's hardly mentioned. So thank you very much, Dr. Michaels. How can people get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest thing to get a hold of me and to read more about my book is to go to the website I put up for the book. It's Dr. David Michaels, that's with an S, drdavidmichaels.com.
drdavidmichaels.com. Very simple. Thank you again.
No, well, thank you. This was very great talking to you.
We have been speaking with Dr. David Michaels, author of The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, Ralph has got a few things on his mind about current events, namely the coronavirus, Donald Trump, and the Democratic primary. But first, let's check in with Russell Mokhiber in Washington, D.C.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, February 28, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. As the offshore oil industry's federal regulator completed its overhaul of a major well drilling safety rule in 2018, the agency's director picked up the phone to a staff engineer to order up some changes. Scott Angel, director of the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, told the engineer to delete language from memos showing that the changes would contradict guidance from the agency's own engineers. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. The memos were subsequently revised, but with no indication that Mr. Angel had personally ordered the changes, the records show. Among the details stripped, a note that agency staffers wanted no change to the testing frequency of critical safety equipment and that the staff does not agree with industry that an industry-crafted protocol for managing well pressure was sufficient in all situations. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Ralph, you've got a few things on your mind, and let's start with the latest developments of the pandemic, the coronavirus.
Well, this is going to be quite a compelling lesson to the American people and the American economy. It's not going to be the only virus coming out of China. And what it has taught us is A, we're not prepared for it. Trump wants to cut the already frugal budget of the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. Number two, it illustrates the extended supply chain to our companies, our tech companies and our food companies and Walmart, who are importing from China. And since China is under heavy quarantine, the streets are empty, a lot of the airports are empty, the stores are closing, the factories are not in full operation. You can have everything you need to build a car in Michigan except a brake pedal from China that you can't complete the car. So that will be used as a tremendously powerful argument against global corporate managed free trade, just in terms of our national security as well as our national economic self-reliance. And finally, what the virus is going to teach us is that we have our priorities completely upside down. If China is closing down, 60-70% of the pharmaceuticals are coming from China and India, and the active materials in these medicines. We don't produce antibiotics anymore in the U.S. How about that for a national security threat? And if China is overcome and semi-closed down because of the coronavirus, what's that going to do to the supply chain of drugs to the United States? So I think we're going to go back to self-reliance. I think we'll get some good arguments as why a country like ours should not outsource critical components, critical products, and jeopardize the supply chain as the coronavirus is doing, and it's not going to be the last virus.
Have you heard any reports that this is more of a public relations disaster for China than it is a health problem? Because if you look per capita, so far more Americans die from the flu per capita than the Chinese are dying from the coronavirus.
It's first of all, it's just starting, David. It's starting and spreading. Now we know that you can catch it from someone who hasn't any symptoms but has the virus in them. So this is the early stages of the coronavirus. And there's also an added fear that once it's in the human body, it may mutate and become much more virulent. So we shouldn't be complacent at all about this. I'm glad to see the New York Times highlighting the urgency of the situation.
Well, to change subjects now, Bernie Sanders is the clear front runner in the Democratic primary. And it strikes me that there's a similar pattern that happened in the Republican primary 4 years ago, where you've got a kind of, that you had a clown car of Republicans who had trouble distinguishing themselves versus an anti-establishment candidate. This seems to be, at least as far as that goes, a similar dynamic where you have an anti-establishment candidate in Bernie Sanders. You have a similar one in Elizabeth Warren, too. And you've got a bunch of these so-called mythical centrists trying to knock each other off. And it doesn't look like that's going to work.
Well, I think if Bernie gets the nomination and he connects with the delegate count of Elizabeth Warren, the others will fall in line because their fear, absolute fear, never mind animosity, of another Trump 4 years will unify the Democratic Party. And Bloomberg, on the outside, will pump a lot of money in Democratic races to take back Congress and to get out the vote against Trump. That's the predictable scenario. But of course, you never know what can happen in terms of unanticipated events. The second thing I would say is Bernie Sanders is a mainstream candidate, defined as putting forth redirections and reforms that are long overdue and that are established in many Western European countries, Canada, places like Japan, and supported by majority of the American people. That's the definition of a mainstream candidate. When the Republicans won with Reagan, they called it a Reagan revolution. They didn't mind using the word revolution, but what they meant was it was a Reagan revolution by, of, and for the plutocrats and the oligarchs. And Bernie's political revolution is really a restoration We had tuition-free higher education in CCNY and University of California system and other public universities after World War II. Maybe a few dollars a semester were paid by the students. We had a Wall Street transaction tax back as early as the Civil War, when the tax was put to help fund the Civil War, and we had a transaction tax that expired in 1968. There's nothing new. That's a restoration. We've had all kinds of Republican and Democratic people, including Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, supporting universal health care. That's a restoration. I mean, what's the big deal? Raising the minimum wage to $15, that restores it to its inflation-adjusted, productivity-adjusted status back from 1968. So we ought to get our categories accurate here. The presidential Democratic primary candidates are called moderates, are tools of the banking system. They oppose $15 an hour. They oppose full Medicare for all, free choice of doctor and hospital. They don't have any understanding how efficient that is. It comes in at half price per capita in Canada. They cover everybody with free choice of doctor. In the U.S., we don't have free choice of doctor and hospital in many areas. And we don't cover 80 million people who are undercovered or not covered. And it's twice as much, over $10,000 per capita per year, compared to Canada's $5,000 per capita per year. So why are we always thinking these things are radical? They're just restorations to the standards of living of hundreds of millions of people in Western Europe and elsewhere.
Well, it seems to me in the debate this past week, Elizabeth Warren actually made the argument that I've heard you make, Ralph, I've heard Rob Weissman make, that the ideas that she and Bernie are talking about are actually very popular, and they poll very popularly. And I think they're starting to make that argument. The press I see is starting to come around a little bit to some of this too. It's fascinating sea change. And I just don't think that these moderate, and again, moderate is just the wrong word. These conservative Democrats are going to be able to overcome this wave.
And Steve, if there were more polls on these questions, your point would be even more supported. Like the national corporate polling organizations almost never poll on corporate crime. If you polled the American people on cracking down on corporate crime, breaking up the big banks that are too big to fail, it would come in 80, 90, 95%. And then people like Bernie and Elizabeth would be able to point to these polls. In the same way for occupational health and safety, the pollsters control a lot of what the agenda is.
Wow.
Because it keeps progressives from being able to say the majority of the American people, left, right, want these changes, and they want them now because they're overdue and because they earned them.
Are there any progressive pollsters?
Almost none.
Wow.
This is a failure of organized labor. They should have their own authentic progressive pollsters, so they put issues that are never polled before the American people. And they can show how much a left-right agreement there is, how many conservatives and liberals, when they're polled on matters confronting where they work, live, and raise their families, come together and agree. Instead of this constant manipulation on a few issues, talking about polarization, red state, blue state. You think the credit card companies stop at the boundary between Alabama and the North? You think pollutants say, well, we're just going to pollute the blue states? That's why they're upset. We're not going to pollute the red states. We got to change the dialogue, listeners. You got to start conversing with people. All starts with waves of conversations all over the country. People you meet in supermarkets, at the water cooler, at the town meetings, at the school auditoriums. It can happen very fast. There is no more authentic speech than word of mouth. Word of mouth is the fastest, most authentic speech because it is transferred from friends and relatives and co-workers. And it can go into lightning pace, millions of people a day once this gets underway. By the way, that's what Madison Avenue tries to do. They try to get excited word of mouth about the latest toothpaste or hot dog.
That's incredible about the polling. I've never even thought about that. It's who's asking the questions and how do they ask them?
That's right.
The main argument, as I see it, between the progressive Democrats and the conservative Democrats seems to be strategically, seems to be the progressives are saying we need turnout. The conservatives are saying, no, you need to get moderate Republicans or never Trump Republicans. How do you assess that, Ralph?
Well, I think getting non-voters to turn out taps into 110 million non-voters coming up in November. That's a much bigger reservoir, and many of them are down and out. They're low income. They haven't voted because they don't see anything valued attached to their vote. They don't see any politicians speaking to their issues, their living wage, their health insurance, their affordable housing, their ease of public transit, which they desire to get back and forth from work. And once you tap into those 110 million people, you bring out 10 million new voters who didn't vote in 2016 in 7 states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Florida, and it's bye-bye Donald Trump. Go back to your failed gambling casinos in Atlantic City.
Okay, this has been a great discussion. Let's just take one listener question before we go. This is from Lynn Mayo, and she says, she's talking about fake presidents. She says, I could not find the Nader Vote website you suggested for finding your 19 policies. Each attempt returned page failed to open. She tried several times.
Well, you're right, Lynn. You must have tried when the website was down for a few days. It is now back up thanks to your communication. We checked it out. It's now back up. People can go to votenader.org on my 2008 campaign, which I've left open, so you can see large number of very important redirections and reforms that were taken off the table in 2008 by both the Republican and Democratic candidates, not even discussed, which I tried to inject in the public dialogue and support. Thank you, Lynn.
Yes, thank you for that question. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest again, Dr. David Michaels. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. As Trump doubles down his impeachable offenses, our book, Fake President, is all the more relevant for people who want to play a role in the neighborhood and in the community for the forthcoming elections.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up, where Steve and David ask a question of Dr. David Michaels.
Doctor, I have a quick question if you have another minute.
Sure, of course.
Doctors have a Hippocratic oath. Does this not apply to other scientists? They can just be bought off by corporate interests to come to the conclusions that they want?
I think they convince themselves that they're doing the right thing. You buy into this world. I mean, even the people who worked for tobacco, it took a long time for them to come around and said, yeah, we're killing people. I think when you're making a product and you're close to it, you think, oh, this evidence must be wrong. So you can't apply something. Any ethics would say you shouldn't be putting something out that's going to cause neurological damage in kids. I mean, it's unthinkable. But there are a lot of people who they're saying it couldn't possibly be true, and therefore I'm going to defend the product. And that's the best I can do, to think that they must be deluding themselves rather than to think they're evil.
What about
devil's advocate?
Well, no, but lawyers don't have to do that. Lawyers, they detach themselves totally. It's fascinating. It's like they apply this idea that every criminal needs the best defense possible, and they think that should apply to toxic chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
Is there corporate funding inside medical schools and research labs?
Oh, of course. And a lot of the people I'm talking about don't just work for these mercenary companies, but they actually are academic scientists, and they get, they take money directly from, the Monsantos or the Johnson & Johnsons of the world. They get hired to say certain things, and they know that if they give them the wrong answer, they won't get hired again. And so they come around, they believe this must be the right answer because that's why they're being paid.
Is there dark money?
Yeah, a lot is hidden that you never really know where the money's coming from. It's often done through attorneys, for example. If you're paid through an attorney, then you don't even have to disclose even a court case, emails and background materials never have to get disclosed because it's all attorney-client privilege.
Yeah, and you go into that in your book.
Yeah, the tobacco industry did that. Now a lot of these companies do that.
Right.
One of the things I try to do is to try to get, at least if you're involved in a federal regulation, you have to say, who paid for this? And that caused the Republicans to go crazy. That's like a simple question, and it shouldn't be controversial.
And that's a wrap. Join us again next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way